A black girl in a wheelchair raised her voice, and the world could no longer ignore her. They were called invisible, but now everyone saw them. Subscribe to experience this story of strength, struggle and love. Amara sat by the window of the small room she and her family had moved into just weeks ago. The pale light of the afternoon filtered through the curtains, casting long, muted shadows across the floor. She liked it here, at least at first. The house was warm, the neighborhood seemed safe, and her parents spoke of new beginnings with bright eyes, though Amara's own heart was heavy with uncertainty. She was 9 now, but everything felt so much older. The move to the city had meant leaving behind the only place she had ever called home, and now, in this new world, she was small and unimportant. At school, she sat quietly at the back of the class, hoping to be invisible, hoping no one would notice her too much. Her wheelchair, which she had relied on ever since she could remember, was a constant reminder of how different she was, how much she didn't fit. It wasn't just the chair, though. It was her skin, dark and rich, a stark contrast against the pale faces of the children who crowded the schoolyard. Her classmates seemed to look at her with a mix of confusion and discomfort, their eyes darting away when they saw her watching them. Sometimes she caught whispers, sometimes even laughter. It stung more than she could ever explain. She tried to ignore it, but that day she couldn't. As she rolled her way down the hall to her next class, she overheard 2 girls talking in hushed tones behind her. "Did you see her?" One of them giggled. "What's wrong with her? She doesn't even walk," the other replied, her voice a cruel mockery. Amara's hands clenched around her wheelchair's handles. The word stung, but it wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. At lunch, she ate alone, sitting in a corner of the cafeteria, the food on her tray untouched. Her gaze drifted over the other kids, laughing, talking, as if they had some secret she wasn't allowed to know. They seemed so whole, so free, and she felt like a ghost in the middle of their bright world. That's how she felt most days, out of place, unwanted, as if the world had forgotten about her. No one seemed to care. No one noticed when she stayed home from school for weeks, hiding behind the walls of her room, keeping herself company with only her books and the muffled sounds of the city outside. She told her parents she was fine, but they saw it in her eyes, the dullness, the emptiness. They didn't know how to fix it. They couldn't. They didn't understand the battle she fought every day just to stay hopeful, to stay strong. She didn't even understand it herself. A week later, as Amara wheeled herself down the path to school, something was different. There was a new girl standing by the gates, a girl with bright, fiery red hair and a face full of defiance. She wore a black hoodie and ripped jeans, standing tall despite the clear signs of struggle on her face, bruises, scuffed shoes, a deep, protective glint in her eyes. It was as though she was daring the world to hurt her, daring anyone to try. The girl locked eyes with Amara as she approached, and for a moment, it felt like the universe itself paused. She was like a mirror, broken, beautiful, and powerful in a way that made Amara's chest tighten. "Hey," the redhead said, her voice low and steady, not like the voices of the other kids who whispered or laughed. "I'm Maya. You okay?" Amara blinked, surprised by the question. No one had ever asked her that before, not like they really meant it. Not like Maya did. Amara nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond, her words tangled in her throat. Maya seemed to understand the hesitation. She didn't wait for an answer, but instead began to wheel herself alongside Amara. "You know," Maya said with a sly smile, "sometimes the world doesn't make sense. People can be cruel, but you're not invisible." Amara turned her head toward Maya, startled. The words hit her in a way she hadn't expected. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Maya glanced sideways at her, a fire in her eyes. "You're not invisible," she repeated. "Just because they can't see you doesn't mean you're not here. You matter. We all do. And if they can't see that, then it's on them, not you." They didn't speak again as they continued down the street to school. For the first time in a long time, Amara felt a flicker of warmth inside her, something small, something that felt like hope. As the days passed, Amara and Maya became inseparable. Maya taught her how to fight, not with fists or words, but with strength, with the quiet power of resilience. Maya didn't care about Amara's wheelchair, or her skin, or the fact that she was different. Maya saw her, really saw her, as someone worthy of standing up for. "You're more than this," Maya said one afternoon, her voice firm as they sat together in the school library. "You can't let them win. You can't let anyone make you feel small." Amara took a deep breath, staring out the window at the world beyond, a world she had once felt so disconnected from. She felt something stir inside her, a fierce, unshakable truth. Maya was right. She was more than this. She was more than her disability, more than her skin, more than the isolation that had once consumed her. With Maya by her side, Amara began to stand taller, to roll through the world with her head held higher. Slowly, other kids started to notice her too, really notice her. They saw the girl who wasn't afraid to speak her mind, who wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. But it wasn't just Maya who had helped her find her strength. It was the fire that burned in both of them, the shared understanding that they were not simply victims of the world, but fighters. One day, while walking down the street with Maya, Amara stopped in her tracks when she saw a group of children from school standing in a circle, laughing and pointing. Her stomach turned, the familiar feeling of dread creeping up on her. She tried to turn away, but Maya stopped her. "No," Maya said, her voice calm but unwavering. "Not this time. We're not going to run away." Maya marched straight into the circle, standing tall and unflinching. The kids fell silent as they looked at her, confused. Amara stayed behind, uncertain but trusting Maya. Maya wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid of them, or their cruelty, or their ignorance. "What's so funny?" Maya asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. One of the kids looked up, then quickly looked away. Another tried to stifle a laugh. "You think it's funny to make fun of people?" Maya continued, her eyes narrowing. "You think it's funny to treat someone like they're less than human?" The circle of kids shifted uncomfortably. Amara watched from the sidelines, her heart pounding. She had never seen someone confront this kind of hate head-on before. Maya's words cut deep, and the power of her conviction spread like wildfire. The kids didn't know how to respond. Some looked ashamed, some defensive, but none of them had the courage to say a word. "Amara," Maya said, turning toward her with a grin that was both fierce and kind. "You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be heard." Amara felt something inside her stir, something she hadn't known was there, not really. It was a kind of peace, a kind of resolve. "You're right," Amara whispered. "I deserve to be seen." And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged, like she was no longer invisible. As the weeks passed, their friendship grew stronger. Amara no longer felt like the quiet, lonely girl she had been when she first arrived in the city. With Maya by her side, she learned to fight, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been pushed to the margins, every person who had ever been made to feel small. She realized that the fight for equality wasn't just something that happened in the streets or in the halls of government buildings. It started in places like schoolyards, with people like Maya who weren't afraid to stand up and say enough was enough. They were both fighters now, not just survivors. The days grew warmer, and for the first time since moving to the city, Amara felt like she could breathe. The world was still imperfect, still full of pain and hurt and injustice, but now she knew that there was something she could do about it. She had her voice. And with that, she could change everything. She and Maya had begun to gather other kids, kids who had been quiet like her, kids who had been ignored or silenced. Together, they started a movement, one that spread through the school like wildfire. They called it, "Not Invisible." It was their call to arms, their pledge that they would no longer stand idly by while others were ridiculed, mocked, or oppressed. They would fight for themselves, and they would fight for each other. Amara had never felt stronger, never felt more alive. And in those moments, as they gathered in the cafeteria to plan their next move, she felt like a fire had ignited inside her, a fire that would burn for as long as she lived. But still, there was something more, something unspoken, that hung between her and Maya, something neither of them had yet dared to name. A quiet yearning, a spark that flickered whenever their eyes met, a soft but undeniable pull in the air that neither could ignore. It was a love, of sorts, a love born of shared struggle and solidarity, of fighting together against a world that had tried to break them both. It was a love that neither of them could yet fully understand, but both felt deep in their bones. It was a love that would change everything. The summer air was thick with the scent of pavement and rain, the city humming like a restless creature beneath the sky's bruised purples and grays. Amara and Maya sat on the rooftop of Amara's apartment building, their legs dangling over the edge. The world sprawled below them in a tangled mess of light and shadow. The city had never felt like home, not really, but with Maya beside her, it felt like something close. It had been months since they started Not Invisible, and what had once been a whisper in the halls of their school had become a roar, an unstoppable force that neither the teachers nor the other students could ignore. More kids joined every week, some who had been mocked for how they looked, some for how they spoke, some for simply existing in a way that the world found inconvenient. They shared their stories in hushed voices at first, then louder, until the silence of their suffering was broken completely. The first time Amara had spoken to the entire group, she had felt her hand shake against the wheels of her chair, her voice unsteady, uncertain. But then she had met Maya's eyes, that quiet fire burning behind them, and she had found her strength, the words pouring out of her like a river that had been dammed for far too long. "We are not weak," she had told them, her voice steady now, powerful. "We are not mistakes. We are not things to be pitied or mocked. We are here, and we will not disappear just because the world refuses to see us." The words had echoed in the quiet, then gave way to something stronger, applause, cheers, the sound of something shifting, breaking, and rebuilding all at once. That was the first night Amara realized what she had become, what she and Maya had built together. But the fight was far from over. There were still whispers in the hallways, still sneers thrown her way like knives, still teachers who ignored the cruelty that festered right beneath their noses. The principal had called them into his office once, sitting behind his heavy wooden desk with tired eyes and a forced smile, telling them that while their little movement was admirable, perhaps they were making too much of a fuss. "Not everyone will understand what you're doing," he had said, fingers steepled together like he was explaining something they were too young to grasp. "Not everyone wants things to change." Maya had scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest, but it was Amara who had spoken first, her voice sharper than she had ever let it be. "It's not about what they want," she had said simply. "It's about what's right." The principal had sighed, rubbing his temples, and eventually let them go with a warning. They hadn't listened. They never would. Now, on the rooftop, the sky above them pressing down like a great, endless weight, Amara turned to Maya, studying the way the wind tangled in her red curls, the way her eyes glowed in the dim light. There was something unspoken between them, something that had been growing for months now, something neither of them had the words for but both of them felt. Maya was fire and fury, a storm wrapped in human skin, but with Amara, she was something softer, something steady. Amara had never known what it was to be looked at the way Maya looked at her, as if she were something unbreakable, something brilliant. It scared her in a way she didn't quite understand. "You're quiet," Maya said, nudging her shoulder gently. "What's on your mind?" Amara hesitated, then shook her head with a small, knowing smile. "Everything," she admitted. "You ever wonder what it would be like if we were different? If we weren't us?" Maya's brow furrowed slightly. Then she shook her head. "No," she said simply. "I don't. Because I like us. I like who we are." Amara swallowed past the lump in her throat, feeling something swell inside her, something like fear and hope tangled together. "Do you ever wish it was easier?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Maya was quiet for a long time, then exhaled slowly. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But easy isn't always right. And if we stop fighting, then who will?" Amara looked away, back out over the city, the streets glowing beneath them like veins of molten gold, pulsing with life. The world was vast, endless, and terrifying, but for the first time, she didn't feel small. She felt like she could shape it, mold it into something better. They spent the rest of the night talking about things that didn't matter, things that did, things that filled the spaces between them like carefully placed bricks, building something unshakable. And then, one day, everything changed. It happened fast, too fast, the way life always seems to turn in on itself when you least expect it. Amara had been waiting outside school, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair, when she heard the shouting. Her stomach turned before she even saw what was happening. A group of older boys had cornered Maya against the side of the building, their voices sharp, cruel. She recognized them instantly. Kids who had always lingered on the edges, watching, waiting, filled with a kind of hatred that had no name but burned all the same. "You think you're better than us?" one of them sneered, shoving Maya back against the brick wall. "You and your little cripple friend?" The word cut through the air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Amara's breath caught in her throat, but before she could move, before she could speak, Maya lunged. Fists swung, bodies collided, the air crackling with violence. Someone shoved Maya hard, and she stumbled, her head slamming against the wall with a sickening crack. And then silence. The boys ran, vanishing into the crowd of students who had gathered, their faces wide-eyed and useless. Amara moved before she even knew what she was doing, her wheels skidding against the pavement as she reached Maya's side. "Maya," she whispered, shaking her gently. "Maya, wake up!" But Maya didn't move. The world tilted, spun, collapsed in on itself. The sirens came next, the flashing red and blue lights painting everything in a cruel, unrelenting glow. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and sorrow, the halls too white, too cold. Amara sat beside Maya's bed, gripping her hand so tightly she thought it might break. "You're okay," she murmured, over and over. "You have to be okay." Hours passed, then days. When Maya finally opened her eyes, Amara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. "Hey," Maya rasped, her voice weak but still hers, still strong. Amara let out a choked laugh, pressing her forehead against their joined hands. "Hey," she whispered back. "You scared me." "Yeah," Maya smirked. "Scared myself too." But something had changed. The fight had become real in a way it hadn't been before. The world had struck back. And now, they had no choice but to strike harder. They were going to change things, no matter the cost. Because Maya was right. If they didn't, then who would? The days after the attack felt like walking through a dream, a distorted and unbearable haze where time stretched and shrank without reason. Amara stayed by Maya's bedside, gripping her hand as if afraid that as she let go, Maya might slip away into the nothingness between life and death. The hospital was a sterile, too bright purgatory filled with beeping machines and nurses who spoke in hushed tones as they moved around her, but Amara barely noticed them. All she saw was Maya, pale against the sheets, bruises blooming across her face like dark flowers, her fire dimmed but not extinguished. Amara had never been so afraid, not when she was a child learning that her legs would never work the way other children's did, not when she moved to the city and found herself swallowed whole by loneliness. This fear was different. It dug into her bones, gnawed at the fragile threads of her heart. It was the fear of losing something irreplaceable, the fear of losing Maya. She barely left the hospital, sleeping in stiff plastic chairs, ignoring the worried glances from her parents when they came to visit. They didn't understand, couldn't understand. Maya wasn't just a friend. She was something more, something vital. Amara didn't know how to name it, This feeling that coiled in her chest whenever Maya looked at her, whenever she smiled, whenever she touched her hand just a little too long. It was more than friendship, more than loyalty, more than anything Amara had ever known. And the thought of losing it was unbearable. The news of what had happened spread like wildfire through the school, through the city. The police came, asked questions, but Amara saw the way their eyes flickered with indifference. They weren't going to do anything. The boys who had hurt Maya would get away with it. They always did. And something inside Amara snapped. She had spent her whole life being quiet, being invisible, shrinking into the corners where the world wouldn't notice her. But not anymore. The day Maya was released from the hospital, bruised but standing, Amara made her decision. Not invisible would no longer be just words whispered in hallways, no longer a secret rebellion hidden in the shadows. It would be something bigger, something louder, something impossible to ignore. Maya saw it in her eyes before she even said a word. "You're planning something," Maya said, her voice rough but teasing, that familiar spark of mischief creeping back in. "Tell me." And Amara did. That night, they gathered the others. More than before. Not just the kids who had always been part of Not Invisible, but others. Kids who had been silent, afraid, too beaten down by the world to believe things could ever change. But they weren't afraid anymore. Maya's attack had shaken something loose. It had shown them that the world would never give them respect, never give them safety, unless they demanded it. So they did. They planned the protest for Friday, the day the school held its big annual assembly, the one where the principal and the teachers stood on stage and pretended they cared about the students, about their futures, while doing nothing to protect them. It would be the perfect stage. Amara could feel it in her bones. The world was about to change. Friday came, and the air felt electric, charged with something dangerous and beautiful. Amara and Maya rolled side by side into the auditorium, their army behind them. The students who weren't part of Not Invisible whispered, shifting in their seats, sensing something was coming but not knowing what. The teacher stood at the front, oblivious, the principal taking his place on stage, clearing his throat to begin his speech. And then Amara wheeled herself forward, right into the center of the aisle, right where everyone could see her. And she spoke. "Enough." The word rang through the auditorium like a bell, clear and sharp, cutting through the murmurs and confusion. The principal hesitated, blinking down at her. "Amara, you need to know," she said, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "We've been silent for too long." She turned, looking at the sea of faces, some watching with curiosity, some with fear, some with a dawning realization that this was something big. "We are not invisible," she said, her voice rising. "And we will not be ignored anymore." And then, one by one, the others stood. Some were in wheelchairs, some were standing, some were still bruised from battles no one had ever seen. But they were together, and they were strong. And then the chanting began. "Not invisible. Not invisible." It started small, but it grew, louder and louder, filling every inch of the space, drowning out the principal's feeble attempts to regain control. The teachers looked panicked, unsure of what to do. But the students? They rose. Even the ones who had never spoken out before, even the ones who had laughed at Amara once, even the ones who had never understood what it meant to be different, to be outcast, to be unseen. They stood. Because they saw now. They saw Amara. They saw Maya. They saw all of them. And they couldn't ignore them anymore. The doors burst open, security rushing in, but Amara didn't stop. None of them did. They were louder now, chanting, stomping, making their presence undeniable. The news camera showed up next, drawn by the noise, by the power of it. And the world saw. For the first time, the world saw them. The consequences came fast. Detentions. Suspensions. Threats. But it didn't matter. Because the video spread, went viral. Because people outside the school saw them now too. Activists. Journalists. Lawyers. The world was watching. And the world was listening. The change didn't come all at once. It never does. But it came. The school could no longer ignore them. Policies changed. Teachers were fired. The boys who had attacked Maya were arrested when the pressure became too much to sweep it under the rug. And beyond their school, beyond their city, others began to rise too. Not invisible spread. Amara watched it happen like watching a wildfire race across dry land, unstoppable, undeniable. And through it all, Maya was there. Always beside her. Always watching her with that same fierce, unwavering gaze. "You did this," Maya said one night, as they sat on the rooftop again, the city stretching below them, changed, still imperfect but shifting in ways they never thought possible. Amara turned to her, something heavy and aching in her chest. "We did this," she corrected. And then, because she couldn't hold it back anymore, because the world had already been set on fire, and there was no turning back, she reached for Maya's hand, threading their fingers together. Maya didn't pull away. She only smiled, small and knowing, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. "Yeah," Maya murmured. "We did." And in that moment, beneath the endless sky, in the heart of the city that had once tried to break them, Amara realized that they had already won. The days that followed felt like living inside a storm, an unstoppable force that had been building for years finally breaking free. The school tried to regain control, but it was too late. The protest had shaken something loose, and the world had already seen. The video spread like wildfire, millions watching as Amara's voice rang out through the auditorium, as the students rose together, as the teachers stood frozen, powerless, no longer able to pretend that nothing was wrong. News outlets called it a revolution. Parents who had never paid attention before flooded the school with emails and phone calls, demanding answers, demanding justice. The principal released a statement filled with empty words about inclusivity and student safety, but no one believed him. He was forced to resign a week later. The school board announced new policies, new protections for disabled students, new rules against bullying and harassment. But Amara and Maya knew better than to trust words alone. They had spent their whole lives being promised things that never came. They would not stop now. Not Invisible was no longer just a movement within their school. Students from other schools began reaching out, asking how they could start their own chapters, asking how they could fight back too. Amara spent hours responding to them, drafting guides, sharing resources, working late into the night with Maya by her side. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for every kid who had ever felt invisible, for every person who had ever been made to believe they were less. The city took notice. Then the state. Then the country. Politicians mentioned them in speeches. Celebrities tweeted about them. Laws were proposed in their name. And Amara should have felt triumphant, should have felt like she had finally won. But there was something hollow inside her, something unsettled. Because for all the change they had sparked, there were still whispers in the hallways. There were still looks, still smirks, still cruel words muttered under breaths when they thought she couldn't hear. Some people would never change. And that was the hardest truth to swallow. Not everyone wanted the world to be better. Not everyone believed in what they were doing. And Amara had to live with that. But she wasn't alone. Not anymore. She and Maya still sat on the rooftop at night, watching the city lights flicker like dying stars, their hands always brushing, always close. Amara had stopped questioning what they were to each other. She had stopped trying to name it. Some things didn't need words. Some things just were. But even as the movement grew, even as the world shifted beneath their feet, there was still one thing left unfinished. The boys who had hurt Maya. The ones who had gotten away with it for so long. The school had expelled them after the pressure became too much, but it wasn't enough. Amara wanted more. She wanted justice. She wanted them to know that their actions had consequences, that they couldn't just disappear into another school, another life, and do it all over again. So she and Maya found them. It wasn't hard. They still lurked in the shadows of the city, still thought themselves untouchable. They had always been the kind of boys who moved through the world without fear, who laughed when others cried, who took without thinking. But they weren't untouchable anymore. Amara didn't believe in violence. Not really. But there were other ways to fight. They exposed them. Every cruel thing they had ever said, every attack, every threat. They made sure the world saw them for what they were. And one by one, their futures unraveled. Colleges rescinded their acceptances. Jobs refused to hire them. Their names became curses whispered in the dark. They weren't laughing anymore. And maybe that shouldn't have made Amara feel better. But it did. For the first time in her life, she felt powerful. The school year ended in a blur. Maya and Amara spent the summer traveling across the state, speaking at rallies, meeting other students who had taken up their cause. They stood on stages in front of thousands, their voices rising together, no longer afraid, no longer invisible. And then, one night, standing outside a small motel in a town neither of them knew, Amara turned to Maya and finally said the words that had been living inside her for so long. "I love you." The words felt fragile, dangerous, like something that could shatter if spoken too loudly. But Maya only smiled, her eyes bright in the dim light. "I know," she said, and then she kissed her. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't explosions. It was something quieter, deeper. Like coming home. They spent the rest of the summer like that, tangled together in moments of stolen warmth, in the spaces between speeches and protests, in the quiet places where the rest of the world couldn't touch them. They weren't just fighting anymore. They were living. And then fall came, and everything changed again. The government passed the first of the not invisible laws. Real, tangible change. Schools across the country were forced to create protections for disabled students, to ensure that kids like Amara would never again be made to feel like ghosts in their own classrooms. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the end. But it was a beginning. The night the bill passed, Amara and Maya sat on the rooftop once more, the city stretching out before them, endless, waiting. "We did it," Amara whispered, her voice filled with something like wonder, like disbelief. Maya nodded, squeezing her hand. "We did," she agreed. But Amara knew better than to think this was the end. The world would keep pushing back. There would always be those who wanted them to disappear, who wanted them silent. But they had already proven they would not be silenced. They had already won battles no one thought they could. And there would be more battles ahead. But Amara was no longer afraid. She turned to Maya, feeling the weight of everything they had built, everything they had lost, everything they had fought for. "Are you ready?" she asked. Maya grinned, that same fire in her eyes that had been there from the very beginning. "Always!" And together, they faced the horizon, the future stretching before them like an open road. The fight was not over. But they would never stop fighting. Never again. Because they were not invisible. And they never would be again.